The coronavirus pandemic stole from President Donald Trump his most prized political possession, a booming U.S. economy. Now racial unrest in Minnesota threatens to steal his second most prized one, an image of power and stability that he can project to supporters and adversaries alike.
Hours into a spate of destruction and arrests in Minneapolis after the police killing of an unarmed black man, Trump was already threatening to send in the National Guard and warning that looters in the city would be shot, employing a phrase popularized by a former Miami police chief famous for tough on crime policies that targeted citizens of color.
Trump walked back the latter statement a few hours later, saying he only meant that looters could end up shooting people, not that they should be shot. "I've heard that phrase for a long time. I don't know where it came from or where it originated," he declared later. "I wouldn't know a thing like that."
But his immediate jump to a forceful and potentially deadly resolution to the unrest underscored what knowledgeable sources said is deep distress at events that, in Trump's view, make him appear weak. He told reporters at the White House on Friday that he didn't want Minneapolis to descend further into lawless anarchy and chaos.
"There's a personal branding aspect to that desire," one senior administration official told the Daily Beast. He sees civil disturbance as a referendum on his leadership, the source said. "A show of force like sending in the National Guard is a way to reassert that authority and show he's in control." A key component of Trump's political appeal amid his meteoric rise during in 2015 and 2016 was his reliance on old-school law and order rhetoric that tacitly, and sometimes explicitly, laid the blame for civil unrest at the feet of his opponents and Washington's political class. In many cases, that manifested in his reactions to previous riots and demonstrations in response to high-profile police killings. "Our country is totally fractured and, with our weak leadership in Washington, you can expect Ferguson-type riots and looting in other places," Trump tweeted in the wake of unrest in Ferguson, Missouri, following the police shooting of Michael Brown. That unrest, in Trump's view, made the country and its leaders look weak and ineffectual. As China and the rest of the world continue to rip off the U.S. economically, they laugh at us and our president over the riots in Ferguson, he declared in one tweet. "Can you imagine what Putin and all of our friends and enemies throughout the world are saying about the U.S. as they watch the Ferguson riot," he said in another. In Trump's mind, he was the antidote, and his supporters latched onto that image of a strong leader in firm control. The prospect of losing that image, and winding up on the receiving end of the same sorts of barbs he threw President Barack Obama's way in 2014, makes him prone to visceral reactions when cable news networks broadcast images such as a burning American city onto his television, the former administration official said. It was the same impulse that led Trump to suggest in 2017 that he might employ the National Guard in an attempt to quell high rates of violent crime in Chicago. Just a year earlier, he'd booked a rally in the city that devolved into chaos when protesters succeeded in shutting down the event. Trump tried to turn it into a political asset. "The protesters," he said at the time, "have totally energized America." The unrest that Trump makes political hay of, in the end, is almost always the episodes that involve minority communities. As president, he notably tried to play the role of reconciliator for the white nationalist riots that upended Charlottesville and resulted in the death of a young woman. In the days prior to Minneapolis burning, Trump urged the Democratic governor of Michigan to have empathy and even meet with the armed white protesters who were demanding that she reopen the state more quickly in the wake of the COVID-related shutdown. That dichotomous approach is part of his political appeal. And as he was walking back the harsh tones of his looter tweets, some in the conservative media were encouraging him to act on it, fearful that something perceived as less forceful would be a potential body blow to his political brand. "Where is the law and order president?" asked Spectator columnist Amber Athey on Friday. "President Trump ought to be the tough but moral leader the city needs right now," Athey wrote, but his initial response was just as spineless as the rest. As he continues to address the matter in the coming days and weeks, it's highly unlikely that Trump will drift away from his typical tough-on-crime posturing, in part because he sees it as so integral to his political identity and victory. The president sees attacks on the police as an attack on a key constituency, said a current senior Trump administration official.
He sees his strong support for police officers as a core part of who he is as a winner. I've heard him say several times, in recent months, things like, "I will never abandon our police. Joe Biden will."
But there are complications. Trump isn't simply running for office anymore. He's holding it. And a tinderbox like Minneapolis is not so easy to address when the buck now stops with you.
Just as he mused they would after Ferguson, Chinese government mouthpieces were quick to seize on the unrest there Friday to try to ding the administration.
Minneapolis. Hours after a former Minneapolis cop was charged with murder in the death of George Floyd, protests exploded in major cities across the country on Friday night, with at least one person shot dead, police vehicles set ablaze, windows smashed in, and protesters attempting to storm buildings.
Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Dallas, Richmond, Detroit, Fort Wayne, Brooklyn, Washington, Omaha, Denver, Des Moines. In city after city, chanting crowds unleashed anger, and police responded with tear gas and pepper spray.
Harrowing scenes unfolded on TV and social media, projectiles being lobbed at SWAT officers protecting the CNN Center in Atlanta, an NYPD van engulfed in flames, a Los Angeles officer attacked by a crowd, cars accelerating into protesters in Bakersfield and San Jose, a Louisville reporter crying out that she was being hit by rubber police bullets.
A 19-year-old man was shot dead by an unknown gunman at a protest in Detroit. The White House was briefly locked down as nearby protests grew hot. The Pentagon reportedly put military police units on alert that they could be deployed to quell unrest.
The night before, Minneapolis had burned, with protesters taking over the station house where Officer Derek Chauvin was assigned before he kneeled on Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes.
Chauvin was charged Friday with third-degree murder, but the city still boiled with fury. A curfew was in place in Minneapolis and its sister city St. Paul on Friday night, but protesters ignored it and massed, some angry that the officers who stood by while Floyd pleaded, "I can't breathe," had not yet been charged.
"I don't plan on entertaining any curfew," 33-year-old Joseph Bennett of St. Paul told the Daily Beast. "Ideally, things shouldn't go down like this. But justice hasn't been fully served yet.
The looting, fire, that's what gets things heard," he added. "Whatever it takes."
Outside the 5th Police Precinct, an atmosphere of lawlessness took hold. A diverse crowd looted at least 3 stores and a post office. Inside a wide-open Dollar Tree within eyesight of the police station, 3 young white men lit paper products on fire to cheers of "Burn the Bitch Down." For hours, not a single police officer was seen around the station as helicopters hovered above and fireworks flew through the air.
Police moved in around midnight with a sudden show of force and used tear gas to disperse people from the parking lot of a Wells Fargo that was on fire.
Governor Tim Walz condemned what he called wanton destruction, saying what began as peaceful social justice protests had morphed into something incredibly dangerous.
"The absolute chaos, this is not grieving, this is not making a statement," he said as officials announced more National Guard members would be deployed.
The skirmishes in other cities were just as dramatic.
In New York City, after hundreds of people swarmed to meet police officers outside the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, cops unleashed pepper spray on the chanting crowd. The demonstrators dispersed, but only temporarily. An NYPD van, abandoned by police to the crowd, was set on fire near Fort Greene Park. Law enforcement sources said there was a thwarted attempt to take over the 88th Precinct station house.
In one clash captured on video, an NYPD officer called one protester a "stupid fucking bitch" before throwing her onto the ground.
"This was me, and I want to make one thing clear to all the people that are commenting lies below this video," someone who claimed to be the woman wrote on Twitter. "I did not spit in this officer's face. I was wearing a face mask. He told me to get out of the street and then immediately threw me out of the way."
In Atlanta, a peaceful demonstration turned chaotic and violent outside the CNN Center. Police used pepper spray but the crowd stood its ground. The building's sign was defaced with spray paint, windows were smashed in, and objects were hurled into the lobby, where police stood in a phalanx and a correspondent standing in the stairwell gave live reports.
I have a daughter and wife I want to get home to tonight, correspondent Nick Valencia told anchor Chris Cuomo as the confrontation appeared to be on the verge of spinning completely out of control.
On the other side of the country, in Bakersfield, California, demonstrators marching through the streets were suddenly subjected to horror as a car sped up and drove into the crowd, striking at least one person as onlookers cried out. A similarly gut-wrenching video posted to Twitter, apparently from San Jose, showed a driver deliberately plow into protesters, clearly running over a man whose legs were under the back tire.
It was nearly impossible to keep up with the reports of skirmishes popping up across the map as the night wore on.
Boston police holding wooden bats stood guard outside the Roxbury subway station as hundreds of protesters took to the streets and took down an American flag.
Houston protesters blocked an entrance ramp to Interstate 45, marched on US 59, and reportedly chased away a woman spotted carrying a rifle near City Hall. A police car was vandalized and shoving matches broke out.
Video from Fort Wayne, Indiana, showed people milling about holding signs, then suddenly sparks emerging from tear gas canisters, followed by clouds of vapor. Police officers stood in a long line. All of a sudden, one of them sprayed a young man standing feet away.
In Louisville, Kentucky, where 7 people were shot amid protests late Thursday, basement windows to the Hall of Justice were smashed and a fire was set inside on Friday.
Caitlin Rust, a local correspondent for Louisville's Wave 3, was apparently hit by rubber bullets as she reported live from the protests, shouting into her microphone that the police were aiming directly at us.
Back in Minneapolis and St. Paul, the National Guard was out in force as an 8 p.m. curfew took effect. It did not stop people from taking to the streets.
Officers fired rubber bullets and deployed tear gas, but the demonstrators had them surrounded on 2 sides and refused to budge. After police left the scene, they celebrated what they saw as a victory over the cops.
I think they were trying to trick us or bait us with the National Guard leaving. We came in closer but didn't move after the tear gas, Stanley Jackson told the Daily Beast.
We could tell when the National Guard put on gas masks it was time to get ready. So when they hit us with the gas, we just took it, Armando Morelli said.
After breaking through the police line at Hiawatha Avenue, a crowd marched to the 5th Precinct with no sign of police along the way. They broke windows and entered a post office and banks, including a BMO Harris and a Wells Fargo across the street from the precinct. Cars in a parking lot were set on fire as police on rooftops looked on.
There was word of state police and National Guard surrounding the area buzzing among protesters around midnight local time Saturday, but no initial movement made by either toward the 5th Precinct or those starting fires.
A nearby White Castle and a forklift were also set on fire. Police did not advance to stop them.
Justin Glah, Danny Gold, and Pilar Melendez contributed reporting.